Hey, port, Rome, religion, companion doc, dislike button, all that good stuff. Part 3, here we go. When last we left off, Rome had been changed quite dramatically by their much more direct contact with Greece. This change leading to new gods, new forms of worship, and even new philosophies. This may have all culminated in a sort of growing disillusion with the Roman state religion, as evidenced by a decline in votive offerings from this time period, as well as some writings we can find from some elites that are questioning the more traditional view of the divine that we'd seen in Roman theology up to that point. But just as the Roman state religion looked like it was about to lose all influence, a man would come back and make it really the central figure in so much of Roman religious life. A man who was going to become a god or die trying, or, well, both. Because by the end of this video, Rome would no longer be a republic. No, instead, it would be an empire ruled by a divine monarch, which actually was a much bigger problem for the Romans than I think most people acknowledge. If you watch the first two videos, you'll know that one of the biggest things the Romans focused on with their religion was making sure the gods felt respected. To this end, worshipping a mortal alongside the gods was actually a pretty big taboo in ancient Rome. Recall the gods were either the masters or embodiments of the natural forces in the world. Now, there was some evidence, again, mostly pulling from Cicero, that there was this idea that the gods had at one point perhaps been human. Perhaps Ceres had invented, agriculture for wheat, and so therefore, when she died, she was elevated to that level. However, this doesn't seem to have been hugely popular, and the natural question which would come to your mind would be, okay, well, if you die today, what natural force are you going to be in charge of? If you put the master of the entire sky on the level of a guy who won a few battles, might not the master of the entire sky kind of be like, why am I sharing a stage with this guy? And this wasn't just a cultural taboo. We can see this enshrined in law as well. Roman funeral processions often involved carrying images of dead ancestors. However, images of gods were strictly forbidden, even if you had been the head priest of a cult or in some other way were closely associated with some divinity. However, this was not true of all of Rome's subjects. In fact, their greatest cultural influence, Greece, actively bucked this trend with their concept of apotheosis. Apotheosis is a Greek term meaning literally to become a god. Though the word is Greek in origin, the concept is much, much older. The Egyptians, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, even the Akkadian Empire, all of these civilizations had divine monarchs in some form or another. Alexander the Great made good use of this trope as well, having most of his Hellenistic empire worship him as divine in some capacity, often adding the Greek title Theos. And though Rome had some issues with this, they believed they were first founded by Aeneas, who himself was semi-divine, and then later Romulus, literally the child of Mars and a Vestal Virgin. Now, because again, theology and history like this is always super, super complicated, I do have to caveat here that we don't know exactly how much the ancient Greeks believed these people were genuinely on the level of, say, Zeus or someone like that. There's actually a really funny story that Plutarch relates to us from the life of someone who I'm pretty sure how you say that is Agesilaus the second, who was the king of Sparta in the early to mid 4th century BC. Around that time, it was pretty common in Greece to establish cults to rulers who conquered you, probably as a way to demonstrate loyalty. When Agesilaus conquers the city of Thassos, they come out and say, we're going to pledge a cult to you, we're going to make you a god, to which Agesilaus supposedly replied, make gods of yourselves first, and if you can accomplish this, then will I believe that you will be able to make a god of me also, which, if I may, based. And the Greeks had actually made a Roman a god fairly recently. In the early 1st century BC, Titus Quintus Flaminicus had conquered much of Macedon, then telling the Greek people that they were essentially freed, that Rome wasn't going to, stay in control of them. And when they heard this, certain cities, including the city of Chalkis, I think is how you say that one, Chalkis, decided to offer him a cult. Plutarch, who's writing about 200 years later, actually tells us that the cult was still going strong even in his day, giving us a snippet of the end of the head priest's prayer, saying, to great Zeus, to Rome, to Titus, and to the Roman faith, literally honoring him right alongside their head deity. Now, if you recall from the last video, most of the changes that came about in the Roman religion as a result of their more direct contact with Greece were mostly in the private sphere. The changes that happened on the state level were usually sort of aesthetic, a little organizational, but didn't seem to impact the theology that much. Though I earlier was talking about how problematic this form of worship would be to the ancient Romans, there is some really interesting evidence that certain Romans may have been warming to the idea of apotheosis, at least in the private sphere. One of our best examples comes from Cicero. Again, someone who just, I guess, is the source of this entire series, basically. Cicero only ever had 2 children, a daughter named Tullia and a son named Cicero Minor. Now, Cicero was very overprotective of Tullia, which is why it must have hit him so hard when she would die in childbirth while in her early 30s. This happened in February of 45 BC, and many of the letters we have between Cicero and his friends mention a melancholy really seemed to have gripped Cicero during this time, which he sought to remedy by building Tullia a shrine. Cicero claims he got this idea from reading the writers, presumably Latin and Greek philosophers, although he never names them. He claims that they say this would be the best way to honor her memory. And he seems quite eager to get to work on it, mentioning the shrine in almost every letter to Atticus between March and June of that year. Now, how this relates to apotheosis is that Cicero himself notes one of the problems with building the shrine is there was a law around this time concerning how much money one could pay to build a memorial for a deceased family member. Cicero says, though, that his concern was not, quote, so much on account of the penalty of the law as in order to attain as nearly as possible to an apotheosis, which tells us that Roman law didn't even have a way to deal with this practice of trying to build a religious shrine to a dead person. Minor side note here, you may have heard of the demons,
Manes,
the spirits of the deceased in the Roman religion. But Cicero specifically notes in his work on the laws that the dead should be seen as joining this as a collective spirit. Check the companion doc if you want to read more about that, but usually that didn't involve you maintaining like an individual identity necessarily. Just briefly, note the specific passage from Cornelia Gracchus to her sons in the 2nd century BC. After she is dead and becomes a parenta, a specific and more positive version of a mane, she will not be aware of anything going on. Yet she also notes the deceased of their family her sons would call upon at her funeral would be as gods, implying this nebulous collective spirit of the ancestors, as opposed to a group of ancestors who all maintained their individuality. To argue against myself, to basically just show how complicated this is, there are a few instances throughout Roman history of certain historical figures receiving an element of divine worship. Plutarch relates to us that the brothers Gracchi, who are these populist politicians in the mid-late Republic, were worshipped after they were murdered by the Senate as if they were gods. If you want to see more about the brothers Gracchi, by the way, I did a whole video on them, kind of going through, again, the conflicting accounts of their story, so check that out if you want. There were also records of sacrifice to generals, notably Marius, after large military victories, as well as one to Gratidianus, after he kind of fixed the Roman economy. The really confusing thing, though, is like it's never super specified exactly what was happening. Were these people being worshipped, or were people just sacrificing to gods in their name, or perhaps to their specific genus? These are tough questions that we don't have like obvious answers to. I'll link some people arguing both sides, scholars obviously, in the companion doc if you want to read it. But for me, at least, I do tend to go more with the theory that these were not sacrifices to these people as divinities. They weren't like trying to establish a relationship or gain favor from them. But things would get much more direct and obvious in the 1st century BC, when we finally get to the man, the myth, the demigod, Julius Caesar. All right, I will do it one time, okay? Julius Caesar. But I'm still not doing Augustus, okay? Makes me feel like I'm doing the Oompa Loompa version of blackface. While Caesar was never officially deified while he lived, he spent a lot of time building the groundwork for these later claims of divinity throughout basically his entire public life. In 68 BC, when he was 32, Suetonius relates to us a story in which Julius Caesar says the following: "The family of my aunt Julia is descended by her mother from the kings, and on her father's side is akin to the immortal god. For the Marcii Reges go back to Ancus Marcius, and the Julii, the family of which ours is a branch, to Venus. Our stock, therefore, has at once the sanctity of kings, whose power is supreme among mortal men, and the claim to reverence which attaches to the gods, who hold sway over the kings themselves." Note he specifically says his stock has a claim to reverence which attaches itself to the gods. Not quite saying we are divine, but kind of saying they deserve the same reverence as the divine, skirting a very fine line. And this would be kind of a constant throughout Caesar's life. In fact, during his civil war, he vowed a temple to Venus Victrix if he won, Venus, goddess of victory. But when he won, he instead built a temple to Venus Genetrix, Venus, the generator, the genetic, origin of the family, which was the patron deity of the Julii clan. So though you can certainly make the argument that he's just trying to honor the person who, supported his gens and might have actually supported his victory, it's also not really that much of a stretch to say he's just trying to reinforce this idea in everyone's mind that he is close to divinity. And with Roman religion being so outcome-oriented, they were trying to get the favor of the gods, so the gods would make sure things went their way. Caesar winning his civil war kind of indicated in some fashion that he had to be favored by the gods, at least in some capacity, which would mean that all his talk about being related to divinity, maybe the gods were sort of signing off on that. Now, Suetonius relates to us that many of the honors that were bestowed upon Caesar while he was still alive were already kind of worrying to the Senate, including temples, altars, and statues beside those of the gods, and a special priest, an additional college of the Luperci, and the calling of one of the months by his name. Again, this is all stuff that happened while he was alive. This isn't even talking about the cult that arose after he had passed. So again, a billion caveats. It's unclear how much this was saying Caesar is a god and just Caesar deserves these honors. An important distinction that will get eroded later, so don't worry about it. Caesar supposedly even had a statue of himself placed in the temple of Carinus. Recall, the deified version of Romulus, Rome's founder. And it was inscribed with demigod, although supposedly this was later scratched out. Caesar would even call himself father of the country, which, if you think back to the first video, the father of any Roman family was the head priest of the cult of the Genius of that family, which gave them quite a lot of control over what that family could and could not do. So in many ways, Caesar is using religious language to kind of cement his power over the Roman people in a way tying himself to the gods. Eventually, the Senate would have quite a few issues with Caesar and would assassinate him, although probably a little disingenuous to say that they assassinated him purely for religious reasons. At his funeral procession, supposedly it was interrupted by kind of an outpouring of citizens who then kind of swarmed his body and had it burned right there in the Roman Forum, where they also constructed either a shrine or a column or an altar, depending on who you trust. The Senate supposedly tore this down pretty quickly. My guess would be with the argument that, this might be offensive to the gods if we're, sacrificing and swearing oaths on the name of a mortal in the same place as the gods. But I mean, let's be real, that might have been the theological argument, but I highly doubt that was the genuine thing they were concerned with. It probably was more, trying to consolidate your power in the wake of a fairly significant political assassination. Just saying. Eventually, though, the Senate would cave to public pressure and actually vote Caesar not just a temple and a statue and a priest, but to literally give him a seat among the gods. Which raises a pretty interesting question. Could the Senate really just make someone a god? And the answer seemed to depend not just on who you asked, but potentially even when you asked them. One of the clearest objections we have to Caesar's divinity comes to us from Cicero in his Philippics, which were speeches kind of attacking Mark Antony, who was Caesar's right-hand man while he was alive, and his assumed heir apparent, although obviously when his will was read, his heir was Augustus. In his first Philippic, Cicero comments on a law which granted Caesar not just a temple and a priest, but a date on the calendar. He says, "I could not have been induced to associate any dead man with the worship of the immortal gods, so that a public thanksgiving should be made for him, while somewhere a tomb exists at which offerings can be made." Earlier, Cicero had commented that it made no sense to worship Caesar and his accomplishments when the man who had freed Rome from their kings wasn't worshipped in this manner. Now, you might quite reasonably wonder how Cicero could object to something like this when barely a year earlier he was building a shrine to his own daughter in the hopes that she would achieve godhood. But I'll note you should pay careful attention to Cicero's language here. He's concerned with the public thanksgiving, whereas the shrine to his daughter was private. Remember, the public and private religions in Rome served very different purposes. The private religion was just, you trying to live your life as best you could, form the relationships with what gods you preferred and ignore the gods you didn't. And you could even ignore the gods as a whole. It didn't really matter. But the public relationship was ensuring the survival of Rome itself, Rome as a collective. If even funerals were regulated such that images of gods would not be carried alongside images of mortals, how on earth was putting Caesar on the calendar right next to Jupiter not going to offend the guy? As to how this seeming contradiction was solved, again, it's going to be sort of a multiple choice thing. I'm going to give you a few theories, and you're just going to have to pick the one that makes the most sense to you. This was, though, without a doubt, one of the most frustrating parts of my research. Because normally how I do my research is like I'll read scholarship from kind of both sides and then see what primary sources they're referencing, read those primary sources, and see which side I find more convincing from that. And really the only arguments here were either, well, the Greeks did it first, so that's where the tradition came from, or it was purely political. There was no theological reasoning whatsoever, which that's fair. Like, that's not an unreasonable assumption to take, obviously. But what I'm trying to look at through this series is how, like, the commoner, how the average man kind of interfaced with the Roman religion. Not just, plebs at Rome, but like a farmer hundreds of miles outside Rome. That kind of thing was like far more interesting to me and what I wanted to look at here. So it just kind of sucks that I have to like throw up my hands at such a crucial junction and say, we don't know. But I mean, the truth is we don't know. All we really know is that the people built, an altar or shrine, whatever, to Caesar, and then Senate later voted him divine honors. We don't really know what tipped the scale from a theological perspective for the senators or for the commoners, which seemed to happen well before this point, at least in the city of Rome itself. Anyway, so small rant over. We'll examine some of the theories that I've come across, but it's just this was annoying for me. Practically speaking, this probably was political in some fashion. Cicero actually would change his tune on this idea, saying that Mark Antony he should be castigated for not deifying Caesar quickly enough. And interestingly, he changed his tune right around when he allied himself with Octavian. So probably just a total coincidence. The two things are probably completely unrelated. One theory says that Caesar was not viewed as explicitly being granted any sort of divinity above that of a common man, but that rather the Senate had just sort of asked the gods, hey, if you wouldn't mind, could you give this guy a seat among your ranks where he could, potentially act as like an advocate for the Roman people or something like that. And then the later kind of auspices and importance would indicate that they had accepted this. Notably, a comet supposedly appeared at the games for his deification. This might have come from the idea of like Romulus ascended into heaven, even though that had at least been the idea of the gods. But I will always bring up anytime I mention that Livy's other theory was that the Senate had just killed Romulus and cut his body into pieces and smuggled him out. And that's just... pick one of the two. Which way, Western man? The other theory that I like a little bit more, although it still leaves a little bit to be desired, involves a concept that we have yet to address, the concept of numen. Overall, numen hasn't really been incredibly important in terms of how Roman theology has changed, but much in the same way that the tradition of Apotheosis may have paved the way for Caesar's deification, numen may have paved the way for his worship in his cult. Now, even the exact definition of numen is debated somewhat by modern scholars. The etymology of the word comes from a word meaning nodding, although not in agreement, more to indicate like, oh, I'll take that one, something like that. But there is sort of a vague definition that pretty much everyone does agree on. Cicero writes that everything obeyed a divine numen, or a divine will, so to speak, that caused all the changes that the divinity wished to see in the world. So numen can be thought of as the way in which gods made their will manifest upon earth. It's a very old concept, potentially older than Rome itself. Varro and other Roman writers would credit the Sabines with this concept. Although, again, there isn't really any evidence for that, and etymologically, the word probably is Old Latin in origin. So this might be a Latin original. Now, I will preemptively caveat that the vast majority of all writing Romans have ever done has been lost. However, from what has survived to us, there isn't really any evidence before the 1st century BC of the word numen being used to refer to human power, like humans' ability to, make an aqueduct or something like that. It's solely something that the gods can do. But after the 1st century, we start seeing this term being used a bit more poetically, shall we say. Livy, with his history from the founding of the city being written at like the end of the 1st century BC, would relate to us a story where the Campanians had visited Rome and begged the Senate for help, asking them to hear the cries of the Campanians and use their numen to fight off the Campanians' enemies. The poet Ovid, who interestingly had been Augustus's close friend at one point, but was later banished by Augustus, would write a poem during his banishment begging the god Bacchus to use his numen to influence Augustus's numen to have his exile overturned. Though again, this is poetry, so if you want to take it as he's just being metaphorical and fancy with it, that's not an unreasonable position to take. So the idea is that Caesar would have a numen, and that this force, which he would have to be able to affect things in the world, would be the actual thing that the Romans were praying to. And so therefore, the way in which Caesar's divinity was sort of solved was it wasn't Caesar who was divine, it was like the power of Caesar, which I know feels like the same thing, but to the Romans there was a distinct difference there. This idea is mostly based on how Augustus would kind of construct his own cult down the line, but I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. And again, there are scholars who disagree with this theory. It makes the most sense to me, but the best argument against it is that Caesar's temples, from what we know, had images of Caesar, not, like images to his numen or something like that. So it is entirely possible that that's not really the answer to this question. If this doesn't satisfy you, again, like I'm right there with you. Feel free to leave your theories in the comments or whatever. If it's a good enough theory, I'll throw it in the companion doc at this note, I guess. But yeah, it's like I said, this specific question is just really frustrating to me that I can't really give you guys like a clear answer on. Regardless of how these questions were answered, Caesar was eventually deified, and his temple would be opened just a few years after that deification was made official. The delay in that, by the way, was because Caesar's assassination led to a power vacuum, which led to another civil war. But the winner of that civil war would go on to hold more power than Caesar could have ever dreamed of holding. So let's now turn to the person who pushed for Caesar's deification, his adoptive heir, Octavian, who would later be known as Augustus. It is really hard to explain just how much power Augustus controlled at this point in history. Rome controlled like this much territory, which contained tens of millions of people. And there were 1 million just in terms of the city of Rome itself. And to varying degrees, these people were all subject to the decrees of the Senate. And the Senate, according to the historians, did nothing without Augustus's approval. And it wasn't just like political power. Augustus had inherited all of Caesar's wealth that he'd plundered from Gaul, which combined with the wealth he got as a result of the Civil War made him, at that point, potentially the wealthiest person in all of human history. If you're curious, by the way, the current record holder is probably Genghis Khan, but it sort of depends on how you define wealth.
Also, just because I know I'm going to get a few comments, yes, Mansa Musa is the clear winner if you want to view wealth in terms of access to funds, as at one point he had control over half the gold in the old world, by the British Museum's reckoning at any rate. But Genghis Khan controlled a large land empire, meaning he had access to more overall resources and people, therefore labor, and again, like I said, it kind of depends on how you want to define wealth. But in his heyday, Augustus was still the clear winner.
He basically had sole control over the largest land empire the world had ever seen up until that point. And he was going to use basically every single tool at his disposal to make sure he could hold on to that power, including religion. Also, heads up to all the Augustus fanboys who didn't get the note at the top of the video. After doing all this research, I have a much more sinister view of him, so get your angry comments ready now.
I do want to interrupt myself here before I proceed with the analysis. I have swung back a little bit towards the middle here. I was fortunate enough to chat with a professor on Roman art and architecture who was able to point me to some evidence that has sort of tempered my view on this. I think overall my analysis still stands, but if you want to read about the nuance, I'll put that in the companion document.
First things first, Augustus poured an enormous amount of his own money into remodeling many of the temples in Rome, which, according to him, had fallen into disrepair. As he was spending his own money, it sort of would make sense that he'd have control over these projects, everything from what the statues looked like to where they were placed to the inscriptions on the temple, many of which were there to remind people who had built that temple, Augustus. Now, you can certainly look at this as, this is just a nice guy who wanted to give back to the gods who had given him so much. But as we go on, I think you're going to see that probably was, at best, a very convenient cover story. See, Augustus's claim to the people was that he was a staunch traditionalist, that he wanted to return Rome to its glory days. This is even evidenced by later historians like Suetonius and Dio walking this crazy tightrope where they talk about how, Augustus actually wanted to restore the Republic. In fact, he tried to several times, but when you know it, the Senate just didn't let him restore it. They just forced him to be dictator first citizen for life, Poor guy. So much of these transformations of these large state public temples can be seen through that lens of someone who, he's trying to just do his best for Rome, and then he's going to quietly retire, but then, well, as long as he's here, he might add a couple inscriptions reminding people who paid for these temples. And, he might remind people that actually the gods are the main reason that, Rome's doing so well. And, boy, Augustus seems to be the one who's doing the most to make sure the gods like Rome again. And things are peaceful. There's no more civil wars. Maybe we should just do whatever Augustus says. Maybe we should just do whatever he says. But Augustus didn't just put his name all over the public religion. In fact, he'd get pretty heavily involved in a lot of the private religious worship as well. If you remember the Lares, they weren't just household spirits. They were kind of any definable space. And one of those definable spaces could be neighborhoods. And so Augustus sort of like reorganized Rome in such a way that he forced all the neighborhoods to surrender their statues and shrines to these Lares, that then he would come in and give them brand new ones. Again, just out of the, the goodness of his heart. Although, of course, a lot of these shrines would also have inscriptions on them reminding everyone, who paid for them. So now, your Grupka, who we haven't really talked about in a while, his chapter on this is interesting because it's called The Redoubling of Religion. And that Augustus kind of, in a way, was pushing back against some of these, again, I hate to use the term atheistic, but sort of the disillusion with the state religion we'd seen before now. And what we would see at the end of this period is that there would be, an increase in votive deposits. We'd see a lot more foot traffic and stuff going into these kind of public temples. So in a certain way, if you do want to look at Augustus as just trying to, revive the Roman religion, he was quite successful at it. He stamped his name over like every inch of the darn thing, too.
I was fortunate enough to chat with Dr. Gretel Rodriguez, an art historian with a focus on Roman art and architecture at Brown, and she was able to point me to some stuff that has tempered my views on this a bit. She mentions that was just pretty common. Whoever held the most political power in Rome just would kind of do that, and that culturally speaking, this may have even been seen as like a duty in some sense, and then Augustus just happened to hold power longer than anyone else before him. Overall, my analysis and opinion of him still stands. Indeed, she also reads a certain element of a sinister nature into it, though perhaps not as much as I do. But I did feel the need to mention that before I go in, because this happened pretty late in editing. I'll put some more thoughts in the companion doc if you care.
In addition to this, he would introduce coins and things, which would pretty much equate him with Jupiter, putting a god on one side, him on the other. Augustus had so much money, he basically just took over the gold and silver mints. In addition, he'd even call himself Divifilius, the son of a god. So he'd claim this connection to divinity. He would push all these images connecting him to divinity. He put his name on every single temple and divine space that existed in Rome. It's just really hard to look at this and see this as just a guy who's just really trying to give back, and not see it as a guy who's trying to remind everyone who's keeping the gods happy. Now, the head of the Roman state religion around this time was the Pontifex Maximus, although, as we've gone over, he wasn't the highest ranking priest, but who cares? This wasn't actually Augustus at first. When that guy died, Augustus made sure that it was him. One of the first things Suetonius records Augustus doing after becoming Pontifex Maximus is seizing every single scrap of paper that could be purported to have any prophetic significance whatsoever and just burning them all. In fact, one of the few prophetic documents he preserved were the Sibylline books, which were essentially these books of prophecy that supposedly the last king of Rome had purchased from some woman. And Augustus, again, just staunch traditionalist here, went around and rounded up all the copies that were circulating in public, and then he himself determined which were the authentic ones and which were the inauthentic ones. So again, just a really nice guy trying to make sure no one was making mistakes out here. This also puts him in control of the calendar, meaning he now gets to determine which gods get festivals on what days. This allowed him to elevate certain cults and kind of lessen the importance of other cults. The best example of this would be the Arval Brotherhood, which originally had just been the cult to Bonadea, the goddess of spring, but now was reworked into the cult that would pray every single year for the safety of Rome and its people. And Augustus would add into this praying for the safety of Augustus, with later emperors reworking it to just praying for the safety of whoever the emperor was at the time. Lastly, Augustus disbanded all public guilds except the ones he determined to be the oldest, stationed his own soldiers at every corner in order to preserve the peace, and set up statues of the great men of Roman history in the temples, supposedly as a reminder to himself to live up to their legacy. And just in case you think I'm the only one kind of putting this sinister spin on his actions, Tacitus, again, one of the oldest historians about the Principate that we have, would relate to us that at Augustus's funeral, there was a group of people who said that he only used duty to the state as a cloak, for him to kind of just get away with doing whatever he wanted to do. But I think the best example of Augustus sort of building his power base through this kind of symbolism and putting his name everywhere comes in the way in which he used art and poetry to insert himself and his family into Roman history in a way that really no one had before. And again, keep in mind, Roman history was religion in a sense. Their myths, before they encountered the Greeks anyway, mostly centered upon their historical figures. One of the best examples of this would be when he commissioned the poet Virgil to write him something. Now, Virgil, prior to this point, had mostly made a name for himself by criticizing Augustus's land seizures, because after Augustus's civil war, he had a lot of veterans to pay, so he just seized lands, from either the allies or certain Roman citizens who hadn't supported him and just gave it to the veterans. Virgil likely found his way to Augustus because he had a patron Maecenas, who was very influential in Augustus's, kind of early reformations. This would become one of the most famous Latin poems of all time, the Aeneid, chronicling the journeys of Aeneas from Troy to Italy and then the adventures he had once he arrived in Italy. And it begins with a prophecy. Then Caesar from the Julian stock shall rise, leading to banished faith shall once again return. But here's the interesting part that most people don't know. Virgil never actually finished the Aeneid.
It's actually kind of an interesting story, so I'm just going to VO it. Virgil, if the ancient sources can be believed, was quite excited about the Aeneid, but it took him over a decade to write. During this time, he'd sent Augustus several drafts, all of which were quite well received. In the final year, he decided to travel to Greece, planning to spend several years revising and finishing the epic poem while he traveled the countryside. Augustus heard of this and cut him off in Athens. We don't know exactly what happened, but they had some kind of meeting, and Virgil was convinced to accompany Augustus's entourage back to Rome. Sadly, Virgil would never make it home, getting sick and dying on the journey there. Now, the really interesting part of this story is as he lay dying, he supposedly called out to his friend to bring him his manuscripts so that he could burn them, as he did not wish them to be published, apparently asking for this repeatedly. Augustus, however, would order those wishes ignored and the work published, supposedly with as few edits as possible, though most of the ancients would admit it was likely edited in some capacity.
We don't know why Virgil didn't want it published. We don't know why Augustus wanted it published so badly. I'll also point out, we don't know if Augustus did anything to the manuscript after this. There's some really interesting questions around this, but that was something I did not know before I looked into this. But maybe Augustus just, really liked the poem and saw how good it was and thought it was a crime to, not share it with people. I mean, hell, Triumph of the Will basically defined, modern cinema, so who says dictators can't enjoy art?
As a final note and alternate theory here, there is a really interesting article that you can read linked in the companion doc that has an explanation that doesn't make it quite so cloak and dagger, on Augustus's part at least. You really should read it, but a brief summary is Augustus had put a lot of money into this, it had taken a long time, and then Virgil says, hey everyone, I'm going to go to the Greek countryside all by myself where anything could happen and take the only copies of my manuscript. Bye. And so Augustus was kind of more worried the manuscripts would be lost. Again, this didn't sway me as much, but I thought it was worth mentioning. If George R. R. Martin wrote a book about me, it would be called The Hedge King.
Now that we have a better idea of just how much control Augustus had over the Roman religion, let's turn to his most enduring legacy, the thing that this entire video is supposed to be focusing on, even though we're like halfway, 3/4 of the way through, and we haven't even touched on it yet. The cult of the emperors. According to Dio, as Augustus was finishing up his civil war, envoys from certain Greek city-states appeared in Rome and asked Augustus if they could worship him as a god. Now, supposedly Augustus agonized over this decision, even though, again, he was pushing the cult to his uncle as hard as he possibly could, but in the end came up with just, such a brilliant compromise. He would allow these temples to be built and would allow the provincials to worship him. However, Roman citizens would not be allowed to worship him. But Roman citizens would be required to sacrifice to Julius Caesar. Again, like, I don't know. I don't like this is probably all coming across as like I hate Augustus. I don't hate him that much, honestly. A lot of the stuff he was able to achieve was really, really cool. And like the peace and stability he brought to the Roman Empire like was huge. Like the Roman economy, he really fixed it for a little bit at least. But boy, the more I looked into this stuff, I was just like, this guy does not let up for like a second. His name needs to be everywhere. He needs to be on everything. It's just him, 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 him. And this cult exploded in popularity. Sometimes his cult would even get syncretized with local deities. We have a shrine in northern Africa to Marazgu Augustus, essentially equating him with Marazgu, like a local deity. Dio, writing in the mid-2nd century AD, would notably state that there was never a temple to a living emperor built in the Italian provinces. But he would indicate that there were shrines built to them. As to why the cult became so popular, again, there are quite a few theories, but I will give you two that make the most sense to me and then links more in the companion doc if you want to read. The first, using our framework from the last video, is that part of why it was so successful was it was just so personal. In many ways, Augustus controlled the lives of the people living in these provinces. Yeah, a lot of times with Rome, they'd kind of let the provinces do their own things, at least outside of Roman colonies or cities. Self-governance kind of stuff. But if you still wanted like a tax break or you didn't you wanted like more grain shipments or something like that, the idea that you could go to a temple and, burn a sacrifice to Augustus and then maybe word can make it to Augustus over, how many people are burning sacrifices to him asking for more grain, that might actually carry some weight. Add into that the forced observances of the cult to the, divine Julius Caesar, Divi Julius, and I think you get a pretty easy answer to this, that to your average person, this is just someone who has helped you out quite a lot, who you can sort of show respect to by sacrificing to them or their Genius or whatever you have, their Numen, whatever, in a manner which can also benefit you in some sense. So there was this idea that part of why it grew so much was, again, this kind of personal touch.
Ovid gives us one of the best pieces of evidence for this theory, stating in the poems he wrote while in exile, "If you can only pray, worship the divine Augustus and petition the God you've known in the proper way. He can bring you feathers and winged chariots. Let him grant your return and you'll have wings at once." Even stating that Ovid himself needs to pray when Augustus is less angry with him, which tangentially is a strong point for religious ritual being about communication.
And when you think about mystery cults, I mean, this kind of makes sense. The imperial cult was almost sort of a fusion between that and like a state cult. The theory I like, which is a bit more cynical, is that the reason the cult exploded in popularity was governors would build it. It was a great way to show your loyalty to Augustus. If you're made the governor of Syria or something like that, build a temple to Augustus and then write back to Augustus and say, oh, thanks for making me governor. By the way, I made you a temple. And you incentivize all the people to go to the temple, and then you get to say, look how many people are attending your temple. I'm doing that. Isn't that so great that I'm spreading your word? Please promote me. Again, it's a little cynical, but so is the vast majority of my analysis of Augustus's kind of religious reforms. So, And again, as much as I'm railing against Augustus, kind of dismantling the Senate and the Republican institutions, there is an argument to be made for the fact that the Senate was overly bureaucratic. Nowadays with Augustus, you could just go to one guy. If you wanted a law changed or something, just get an audience with him, tell him to do it, and then he'll take care of it for you. There is a benefit to that system for the common person that now they don't have to go through this giant bureaucracy. Again, I don't like that system, but there's an argument for it that I think is a perfectly legitimate argument. And again, as someone who oversaw a massive period of peace throughout the Roman Empire, as well as fixing the economy and several other things, he did improve the lives of many citizens and even non-citizens living in the provinces. So when he died, the Senate voted him divine honors, and this was something that it seemed like many people agreed with. Interestingly, though we call it the cult of the emperors, it was originally more just to the gens Julia, or the Julio-Claudian family, which means that there were actually many members of this cult who had been deified, but never actually ruled, including Augustus's favorite wife, Livia, and Nero's second wife, Poppaea, as well as their daughter, whose name we don't know, but died in infancy, I think 4 or 5 months old. Now, the cults would grow and change with each successive emperor. Tiberius would push his father's cult incredibly far, but he would only allow 1 or 2 temples to be built for himself while he lived. And upon his death, he was not deified. So this video doesn't get overly long. I'm just going to very quickly go through the Principate members and the changes they made. But if you want to read more about any of this stuff, again, companion doc. Caligula, the successor to Tiberius, although sources around him probably shouldn't be trusted that much, definitely blurred the line a lot more between the imperial cult being to the the emperor who's deceased and the ruling emperor. It's unclear if he wanted to be worshipped as a living god or just wanted to receive divine honors while he lived, but there probably was something there to some capacity. Claudius and Nero, although they did have some religious changes, didn't really do anything to the cult of the emperors itself, so not too much to go over there. Which brings us to Rome's next civil war, and the big winner of it, Vespasian. In my Nero video, I talked a lot about how Vespasian came to power and a lot of the issues he faced once he succeeded, but to briefly review, the elites really didn't like him. He wasn't their preferred candidate. In fact, on the eve of his battle with Rome's Senate-appointed Emperor Vitellius, who, he also had seized power through military means, but anyway, the Senate liked him at least. Many senators and philosophers and other kind of prominent Romans went out into Vespasian's camp to try and convince his soldiers to stand down, obviously unsuccessfully. Now recall, Julius Caesar traced his ancestry to the gods themselves, thereby also giving most of the Julio-Claudians access to that claim as well. Vespasian, on the other hand, came from an equestrian mother and a merchant father. He didn't really have any lineage to speak of, divine or otherwise. And this was kind of worrying not just to the Senate, but again to the average Roman person. Because was this random nobody really going to hold the same position as had been held by a family of people that were descended from the gods themselves? These were questions Vespasian had to answer. Plenty of these previous emperors still had supporters, and plenty of them didn't like Vespasian. And so he sought to prove his worth by kicking a cripple and spitting on a blind man. With their permission, by the way. They wanted this to happen. They actually liked it. In a very public display, Vespasian would cure the blind and the lame with just his touch. Again, showing everyone that not only was he divinely favored, but he actually maybe even had some powers that the divine were granting him, demonstrating that he should hold this role as supreme ruler of Rome. And luckily for him, as much as I really don't like the guy, he did a pretty good job. He did actually kind of fix a lot of the Roman economy and reorganize a lot of the political structures in, frankly, very positive ways for the common Roman. With his divinity publicly established, Vespasian now turned to modify the cult of the emperors such that it would benefit whoever currently held the seat, not just the gens Julia. He also changed a lot of the older temples to, again, instead of being, Augustus, Caesar, and all those people, to specifically be to the genius of the Roman people. For the first time, the private home religion and the public state religion were really coming together. Perhaps this was because Vespasian kind of pulled an Augustus and just took what was there and, rewrote it to be more what he wanted it to be. But I think in many ways, again, this speaks to the growing obsession with the kind of personal touch in the Roman religion. Regardless of why, though, after this period, the imperial cult would definitely take center stage in the Roman religion, with even citizens finally being allowed to sacrifice to the living emperor, something which had been, again, expressly forbidden up to this point. One of his sons, Domitian, would actually reverse a lot of these changes, though, changing it back to the genius of the current emperor as opposed to the genius of the Roman people themselves. And even though he would get assassinated, his changes would actually stick. Now, the cults would remain largely unchanged after this point, for a little while at least. But what is interesting to note is we do find a lot of cults to individual emperors would still become very popular. Augustus being obviously a very popular one, and the second most popular being Trajan. Now, I'm sure you've heard many things about Trajan, but for our purposes, the most interesting thing to note is that he put a guy named Pliny the Younger in charge of a province. And Pliny the Younger had a problem that he needed to write to Trajan about. Because, you see, he was having an enormous amount of trouble dealing with this brand new cult that was popping up. This cult to this guy named Jesus. That's basically where I'm going to end this part of the series. Obviously, I could do quite a bit more with the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, but I think I'm going to leave that for the Christian part, which will probably still start with a little bit of paganism. If you have any questions about anything we've covered in this or the earlier videos, feel free to leave a comment. Even if it's critical, frankly. If I'm wrong about something, I'll put a note in the companion doc and credit you every single time. I've done it before. As of this recording, I'm actually still in the research phase of the Christianity video, so I don't know when that's going to be out. But I am going to try and have more of an online presence so that you'll at least have some indication. I'm going to try and stop just lurking image boards. Hope you guys enjoy, and I can tide you over while I work on other stuff. I, again, am just super appreciative of all this. I don't think this is ever going to turn into anything big, but it's just... it's fun, and I like interacting with all you guys and putting out videos and stuff like that. So, you know, it's just cool to have a second job. That means I can't sleep that much. If you like the series, please please subscribe, leave a comment. If you didn't like, please dislike, unsubscribe. I guess still leave a comment, but leave an angry one. Whatever you want to do. I just appreciate that you made it this far, unless you skipped right to the end, in which case, why would you do that? There's like 5 seconds left in the video. Take care.
This series would not have been possible without the support of several contributors, including the aforementioned Dr. Gretel Rodriguez, as well as Karen Bouchard. In lieu of credit, another major contributor instead would ask you to make a donation to the Trevor Project, a charity focused on providing support for queer youth. More information about them and a link to donate can be found in the video description.